Story 1. The Phantom Diner. Michael had been working as a food delivery driver for almost a year, mostly taking late-night shifts because the tips were better and the traffic was light. He was used to strange requests, delivering to odd locations and meeting customers at weird hours, but the night of the Phantom Diner would haunt him forever. It was a Friday night, around 11:45 p.m., when an order popped up on Michael's phone. The delivery was for a place called Halford House, an old mansion located on the edge of town. The house had a notorious reputation among locals. Some said it was haunted, others claimed it had been abandoned for years, but Michael didn't believe in ghost stories. He only cared about making his deliveries on time. The route took him far from the well-lit streets of the city into a heavily wooded area. The road was narrow, winding through thick trees with only the faint moonlight to guide him. As he neared the location, his phone's GPS went haywire. The blue dot showing his position jittered erratically before freezing. When he looked up from the screen, Halford House loomed in the distance, barely visible through the fog that clung to the air. Michael parked his car, grabbed the food, and cautiously approached the mansion. It was enormous, with tall windows that appeared dark and lifeless. The porch creaked as he stepped onto it, and the air around him felt unnaturally cold. He rang the doorbell, half expecting no one to answer. To his surprise, the door slowly opened on its own. "Hello?" Michael called, peering into the dimly lit hallway. There was no response, just the sound of the wind rattling through the trees outside. The food was prepaid, so he considered just leaving it on the doorstep and getting out of there. But something compelled him to step inside, just to check if anyone was home. As soon as he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him. Michael's heart raced as he turned to find no one there. The silence was suffocating. He walked deeper into the house, hoping to find someone, anyone, to take the food so he could leave. The farther he went, the darker it became. The once faint glow from the hallway lamps disappeared, leaving him in near total darkness. Then a whisper. "Thank you for the food." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing in the darkened rooms. Michael froze, his skin crawling with fear. The voice was calm but distorted, as if it came from someone who hadn't spoken in years. He turned around, desperate to leave, but the door was gone. In its place was just another dark hallway. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further. Michael's breath fogged in front of him. He heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the shadows. A figure emerged from the darkness, a tall man in an old-fashioned suit, his eyes hollow and his face pale as death. He held out his hand, not for the food, but for Michael. Panicking, Michael bolted. He ran through the twisting hallways, past decaying rooms and broken furniture, searching for a way out. The whispers followed him, growing louder and more frantic. "You can't leave! You're mine now!" Just as he thought he was trapped forever, he saw a faint light, his car's headlights. He sprinted toward it, bursting through the front door, which had mysteriously reappeared. Without looking back, he jumped into his car and sped away. When he reached the safety of his apartment, he checked his phone. The delivery for Halford House had vanished from his app. It was as if the order had never existed. But Michael knew what he had experienced. To this day, he refuses to deliver to any house that stands alone at night. Story 2. The Weeping Woman. Tina had always liked working the night shift as a food delivery driver. The quiet streets, the solitude, it suited her. But one rainy night, she received a delivery request that would make her reconsider working past dark. The order came in just before midnight for a small apartment complex on the outskirts of town. The complex was old, with crumbling brick walls and dimly lit hallways. When she arrived, the rain was pouring down, making it difficult to see as she navigated her way to apartment 7C. Tina knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time. Still, nothing. She glanced at her phone to check if she had the right address, and sure enough, 7C was correct. She was about to leave the food on the doorstep when she heard a soft sobbing sound from inside the apartment. The sound was unmistakable. It was the quiet, heart-wrenching cry of a woman in distress. "Hello?" Tina called out, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Your food is here." The sobbing continued, but no one answered the door. Concerned, Tina tried knocking again, but this time the door creaked open on its own. She peered inside and saw a dimly lit living room. At first glance, it seemed normal. An old sofa, a few scattered magazines, a lamp flickering in the corner, but the sobbing was louder now, coming from deeper within the apartment. Tina hesitated. Something about the situation felt wrong, but her curiosity got the better of her. She stepped inside, calling out again, "Are you okay?" The sobbing stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the hallway leading to the bedroom, a shadow moved. A woman, her long black hair covering her face, slowly walking toward Tina. Her steps were uneven, her body hunched as if in pain. Tina's heart pounded in her chest. Every instinct told her to run, but she couldn't move. The woman's presence was overwhelming, like a dark force pulling her in. As the figure drew closer, Tina could see her face. The woman's eyes were red and swollen from crying, her skin pale and sickly. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, just a guttural, choking sob. She reached out a trembling hand toward Tina. Terrified, Tina backed away, stumbling out of the apartment. She raced down the stairs, not stopping until she reached her car. As she drove away, the image of the weeping woman stayed with her, burned into her mind. The next day, she reported the incident to her boss, who told her that apartment 7C had been empty for months. The previous tenant, a young woman, had committed suicide after suffering years of abuse from her husband. No one had lived there since. Tina never returned to that part of town again. Story 3. The Cabin in the Woods. Chris had been delivering food for a few years, and nothing fazed him anymore. Late-night orders were common, especially on weekends, and he had grown used to driving to remote areas. But one night, an order took him to a cabin deep in the woods, a place he would never forget. The order was placed at around 1 a.m., and the delivery location was listed as Cabin 13. Chris didn't recognize the address, but the app's GPS guided him through winding forest roads to a secluded cabin. The cabin was old and dilapidated, its wooden structure barely holding together. There were no lights inside, and the surrounding woods were eerily silent. Chris parked his car and approached the front door, the bag of food in hand. He knocked, but there was no answer. He waited a few moments, knocked again, but still, no one came to the door. He was about to leave the food on the porch when he heard a faint noise coming from the side of the cabin. It sounded like a child's laughter. Confused, Chris walked around the cabin, peering into the darkness. The laughter continued, growing louder, but there was no one there, just trees and shadows. Suddenly, the laughter stopped, replaced by a low growl. Chris's blood ran cold. He turned to leave, but standing in the doorway of the cabin was a figure, a man, tall and gaunt, his face hidden in shadow. The man didn't say a word, but Chris could feel his eyes watching him, piercing through the darkness. Without another thought, Chris dropped the food and ran. He didn't stop running until he was back in his car, speeding away from the cabin and the horrors that lurked in the woods. The next day, he reported the cabin to his delivery service, but they couldn't find any record of a Cabin 13 in the area. It didn't exist on any map. The order had disappeared from the system as if it had never been placed. Chris now refuses to take deliveries to rural locations, and every time he drives past a wooded area at night, he swears he can still hear the sound of distant laughter. Story 1. The Old Man at the Gas Station. The chill of November was creeping in as Amanda and her boyfriend Jake made their way through the back roads of rural Pennsylvania. They were returning from a weekend getaway in the Poconos, where they had rented a cabin to escape the stress of school and work. The woods surrounding them were thick with bare trees, and the sky above them had turned dark and gray as the sun disappeared behind the clouds. The road ahead was desolate, without a single other car in sight. They hadn't seen a gas station for miles, and as they neared the half-empty mark, Jake began to grow concerned. "We need to find a station soon," he muttered, glancing at the gas gauge. Amanda nodded, looking around at the empty landscape. "There's got to be something coming up. These old roads always have some creepy little gas station somewhere, right?" she joked, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. As if on cue, they saw a flicker of light in the distance. A neon open sign buzzed from the front of a small, run-down gas station sitting just off the road. Relief washed over both of them. Jake pulled in, and the station appeared even more abandoned up close. There was a single rusted pump, and the station's windows were clouded with grime. A pale light flickered weakly inside. Jake stepped out to pump the gas, while Amanda remained in the car, watching through the window. Something about the place unnerved her. It wasn't just the decrepit state of the station, but the way it seemed wrong, like it didn't quite belong there. Then, from the shadows of the small shop, an old man appeared. His face was gaunt, skin pulled tight over his sharp cheekbones, and his eyes were a milky white. He shuffled toward Jake, who hadn't noticed him yet. Amanda rolled down her window. "Jake, maybe we should leave." Before Jake could respond, the old man spoke in a raspy voice. "Need some gas?" He smiled, revealing yellowed, rotting teeth. Jake hesitated but nodded. "Yeah, just filling up." The old man stepped closer. "You're a long way from home, aren't you? Not many people come through these parts anymore." His voice sent chills down Amanda's spine. There was something off about the way he moved, the way he stared at them as if he could see through them despite his clouded eyes. "Where's the nearest town?" Jake asked, trying to be polite while clearly uneasy. The old man's grin widened. "There's no town near here, boy. Not for miles. But don't worry. You're safe. For now." He leaned in, his breath rank and sour. "But if I were you, I wouldn't stay on this road too long. Strange things happen around these parts after dark." Jake hurriedly paid, then jumped back into the car. They drove away without another word. As the station faded into the distance, Amanda finally broke the silence. "What the hell was that about?" "I don't know," Jake replied, his voice tight. "But I think we should keep driving until we find somewhere else to stop." They pressed on, but after an hour they noticed something strange. The gas gauge was still low, lower, in fact, than when they had stopped. Confused, Jake pulled over to check the tank, only to find it empty. "I don't get it. I filled it up," Jake said, his voice trembling now. "That man, that station," Amanda whispered, her voice barely audible. Then they saw it, the same gas station, flickering in the distance, the same open sign buzzing in the night. They had been driving in a straight line, but somehow, impossibly, they had returned to the place they had just escaped. Story 2. The Phantom Farmhouse. It was the first week of November when Mark, a landscape photographer, ventured out into the rolling hills of rural Vermont. The countryside was breathtaking, with its endless fields and fading autumn colors, and Mark wanted to capture the late fall beauty before the winter snow buried it all. He parked his car on the side of a narrow dirt road and hiked up the nearest hill, carrying his camera equipment. As he crested the top, he noticed something strange in the valley below. Nestled between two bare trees was a small, weathered farmhouse he hadn't seen on the map. "That's odd," Mark muttered. He'd scouted the area thoroughly and was sure there was no house here. Intrigued, he decided to take a closer look. As he made his way down the hill, a strange feeling crept over him, a sensation of being watched. The air grew colder, and an unnatural stillness settled over the valley. No birds, no wind, just silence. When Mark reached the farmhouse, it was clear it had been abandoned for decades. The windows were shattered, and the front door hung loosely from its hinges. Vines crawled up the sides of the house, almost as if they were strangling it. But what struck him most was the overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to emanate from the building. Still, Mark was determined to get some good shots, so he set up his tripod and began photographing the eerie structure. As he worked, he swore he heard faint whispers on the wind, though he was alone for miles. Suddenly, something moved in the upper window, a flash of a figure, just for a second. Mark froze, staring up at the window. He waited, but nothing appeared again. Brushing it off as his imagination, he continued photographing. But the longer he stayed, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as though the house was breathing, alive in some way he couldn't explain. After a while, he packed up and hurried back to his car, his heart pounding. When he developed the photos later that night, every shot of the house was the same, except for one. In the final photo, a figure stood in the doorway, a woman in a long, old-fashioned dress, her face pale and blank, staring straight at him. Mark returned to the valley the next day, determined to find out what he had captured. But when he arrived, the farmhouse was gone. The valley was empty, save for the trees and the fields. The house had vanished without a trace, as if it had never existed at all. Story 3. The Knock on the Door. November nights in the Midwest can be bitter cold, and on this particular night, Sarah was home alone. Her husband was working late, and she had the house to herself. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the old house creaked with the settling of the foundation. She was curled up on the couch, reading, when she heard the first knock. It was faint, almost like a tree branch scraping against the side of the house. She dismissed it, going back to her book. Then the knock came again, louder this time. It was coming from the front door. Sarah frowned, setting her book aside. It was nearly midnight. Who would be knocking at this hour? Hesitant, she walked to the door and peered through the peephole. No one was there. Her pulse quickened as she stood frozen by the door. After a moment, she cautiously unlocked it and cracked it open. The night was silent, save for the wind. The porch was empty. Closing the door quickly, she turned the lock and hurried back to the couch. But the uneasy feeling lingered. The wind picked up, and then she heard it again. This time louder, more insistent. A knock. Sarah's heart raced. She grabbed her phone, ready to call her husband, when the knock came again, even louder than before. But this time it wasn't from the front door. It was from the back door, in the kitchen. Her breath caught in her throat. No one could have gotten back there without walking past the front windows, and she hadn't seen anyone. The back door led to a fenced yard, and there was no easy access. She stood still, her phone clutched in her hand, as the knock came again. It was a deliberate, slow, rhythmic knock. She backed away slowly, her hand trembling as she dialed her husband. "Someone's here," she whispered into the phone. As she waited for him to answer, the knocking continued, now coming from all sides of the house. Front door, back door, windows, surrounding her. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the knocking stopped. When her husband arrived half an hour later, the house was quiet, and no one was there. But on the front door, in the faint moonlight, they both saw it, a set of handprints smeared across the wood, as though someone had been banging to get in. Story 1. The Late Night Visitor. James had been working the night shift at a local convenience store for nearly 2 years. He enjoyed the quietness of the shift. Most of the time, he was either stocking shelves or reading a book while the clock ticked towards morning. But there was one thing about the night shift that always left him uneasy: the 2 a.m. hour. Every night at exactly 2 a.m., the store's automatic front doors would slide open and close with no one entering or leaving. It wasn't always easy to catch, but if you were paying attention, you'd see the doors move as if an invisible presence passed through. He chalked it up to faulty sensors and told himself it was just the wind. However, one stormy evening, James's rationality was tested. It was nearing 2 a.m., and the store was dead quiet. Outside, the rain poured in sheets, drumming against the windows. The wind howled, and the trees lining the street bent with the force of the gusts. James had just finished cleaning the coffee machine and was heading to the counter when the store's lights flickered for a brief second. He paused and glanced around, unsettled but still holding on to reason. Then the doors slid open with their signature whoosh, but this time it was different. Normally the doors opened slowly and gently when triggered, but tonight they snapped open with a forceful clang. James froze, staring at the empty entrance. His heartbeat quickened as his eyes scanned the outside. There was no one there, just the rain and the swaying trees. He shook it off and moved behind the counter, hoping that the wind had simply triggered the doors. But as soon as he stepped behind the register, a cold chill swept through the store and he felt a presence. It was as if someone, or something, was standing just out of his peripheral vision, watching him. He didn't dare move. His mind raced. Could it be an animal? A prankster trying to freak him out? Suddenly the lights flickered again, and this time they went out completely. The store was plunged into darkness, save for the occasional flash of lightning from outside. James fumbled for the flashlight beneath the counter, his hands shaking. As he clicked it on, a loud thud echoed from the back of the store. His breath caught in his throat. With the beam of the flashlight trembling, he slowly made his way toward the source of the sound. The aisle stretched long and ominous, the shelves casting eerie shadows that seemed to move in the faint light. The thud came again, closer this time, as though something heavy had been dropped or dragged. He turned the corner into the back aisle, and what he saw made his blood run cold. There, standing at the end of the aisle, was the faint outline of a man. The figure was tall, motionless, and indistinct, almost like a silhouette carved out of the dark. James's breath hitched, and he took a step back. The figure didn't move, but the oppressive feeling of being watched intensified. Before James could react, the lights flickered back on. The figure was gone. He stood there for a few moments, his heart hammering in his chest, trying to convince himself that it had all been in his head. But as he slowly walked back to the counter, he glanced at the store's security cameras. The feed showed the front entrance clearly, and the timestamp read 2:01 a.m. And there, on the camera, a shadowy figure was standing just inside the automatic doors, staring directly at the counter where James had been moments before. Story 2. The Hospital Hallway. Nina was a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, working the night shift in the ICU. She had been in the nursing field for over a decade and was used to the eerie, unsettling feeling that came with working in the graveyard hours. Hospitals were always creepy at night, especially the ICU. The hallways felt longer, the air colder, and the silence louder. One night around 3 a.m., she was making her rounds, checking in on the patients in her wing. It was a quiet night, but something felt off. As she made her way down the main hallway, the hair on the back of her neck stood up. She paused for a moment, scanning the area, but saw nothing out of place. The hospital was unusually still, with only the soft hum of machinery and the occasional beep from monitors. As she approached room 307, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. Room 307 had been empty for the last week, as the patient had passed away a few days prior. Nina frowned and gently pushed the door open, shining her small penlight into the room. The bed was made, the machines were off, and everything appeared as it should. She sighed, feeling a bit silly for getting worked up over nothing, and closed the door. But as she turned to leave, she caught movement in the corner of her eye. It was subtle, but she saw it, a shadow darting across the far end of the hallway. Nina's heart skipped a beat. She called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Silence. Her mind raced. Maybe it was one of the janitors or another nurse, but the shadow had moved too quickly, too silently, almost like it was gliding. She took a deep breath and decided to investigate, walking slowly towards where she had seen the movement. As she neared the end of the hallway, she noticed something strange. The temperature had dropped significantly. She could see her breath in the air, and her hands were shaking from the cold. The hospital wasn't supposed to be this cold. Her heart raced, and she tried to shake off the feeling of dread that was creeping up her spine. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the hallway, causing her to jump. The door to room 312 had slammed shut on its own. Nina's pulse quickened as she approached the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. When she opened it, the room was empty. But as she turned to leave, she felt a cold hand brush against her arm. She gasped and spun around, but there was no one there. She quickly left the room and rushed back to the nurse's station, her skin crawling with unease. Later that night, Nina checked the hospital's incident reports. Room 312 had been where a patient had died under mysterious circumstances months ago. The nurses had reported strange occurrences ever since. Story 3. The Factory Shift. Derek worked at an old manufacturing plant that produced parts for heavy machinery. The night shift was long and grueling, with the constant hum of machines filling the air. He didn't mind the work, though. He was good with his hands and enjoyed the solitude. But one night, something happened that he could never explain. It was late, probably around 2:30 a.m., and Derek was alone in the main production area, running checks on the machines. His coworker Sam had gone on break, leaving Derek by himself for a while. The plant was massive, with rows of machines stretching into the dimly lit distance. The overhead lights flickered occasionally, but that was nothing new. The place was old, and maintenance was always behind on fixing things. As Derek finished his rounds, he heard a strange noise, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone lightly knocking on metal. He paused, listening closely. The sound was coming from the far end of the plant, near one of the old, unused machines. It hadn't been operated in years, and everyone avoided it because of how run down it was. Curious, Derek made his way toward the noise. As he got closer, the tapping stopped. He shined his flashlight on the old machine, inspecting it. Everything seemed normal, but something felt wrong. The air was thick, and the hair on his arms stood on end. It felt as if someone was standing behind him, watching. He turned quickly, but no one was there. Shaking off the unease, he headed back to the control room, but as he walked away, the tapping started again, louder this time. Derek stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. He turned back, shining his light on the machine. In the beam of light, he saw a handprint on the dusty surface of the machine, a fresh, wet handprint. Derek backed away, his mind racing. He hadn't touched the machine, and Sam hadn't either. He was sure of it. As he stood there, frozen in fear, the tapping grew louder, more insistent, like someone was banging on the metal, desperate to get out. Panicking, Derek bolted for the control room, locking the door behind him. When Sam returned from his break, Derek was pale and shaking. He didn't say a word about what had happened, but he never worked the night shift alone again. Story 1. The Knocking on Cedar Avenue. The rain fell relentlessly against the windows of Sarah's small cottage on Cedar Avenue. The house was nestled at the edge of the woods, far from any other homes, making it a perfect retreat for someone who loved solitude. However, tonight, solitude was the last thing Sarah wanted. The storm was ferocious, and as the clock struck midnight, she felt an unsettling sense of being watched. She'd been working late, wrapped in a thick blanket, sipping tea, and trying to finish a painting by the dim glow of a desk lamp. The rhythmic sound of the rain had always been a comfort to her, but not tonight. The darkness outside seemed impenetrable, and there was something eerie about the way the wind howled through the trees. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Startled, Sarah froze, her paintbrush hovering over the canvas. She wasn't expecting anyone, especially not in this weather. Who could possibly be out in such a storm? The knock came again, louder this time, insistent. Sarah set her paintbrush down and stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. She tiptoed to the door, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. Peeking through the peephole, she saw nothing. No one stood outside, just the heavy downpour and the dark outline of the trees in the distance. The knock came a third time, even more forceful. Her breath caught in her throat. "Who's there?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. No answer. Cautiously, she unlocked the door and cracked it open, peering into the rain-soaked night. The wind whipped at her face and cold rain splattered against her skin, but there was no one there. Just as she was about to close the door, something caught her eye. A small, soaking wet envelope on the doorstep. Frowning, she picked it up and retreated inside, locking the door behind her. The envelope was plain, with no markings or address. Her name was written on it in smudged black ink. Inside was a single piece of paper, creased and worn. In shaky handwriting, it read, "I'm still here." Sarah's stomach twisted. What did that mean? Who was here? Suddenly, there was a creaking sound from upstairs. It was soft, barely noticeable, but in the stillness of the house, it was unmistakable. She grabbed a flashlight and slowly ascended the stairs, the wooden steps groaning under her weight. The door to her bedroom stood ajar, just as she had left it. She pushed it open and shone the flashlight around the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but the sense of unease lingered, growing stronger. Just as she was about to turn around and leave, she saw it, the faint outline of wet footprints leading from the window to her bed. The window was slightly open, letting in the cold night air. The footprints stopped right beside the bed, and in the darkness, Sarah saw the crumpled shape of something lying on her pillow, a note. Shaking, she unfolded it with trembling hands. "I've always been here." The knock came again, this time from behind her. Story 2. The Highway Phantom. It was a night much like any other for Marcus, a long-haul truck driver who had become used to endless stretches of lonely highways. The rain had been pouring down for hours, making the already desolate road feel even more isolated. His windshield wipers worked tirelessly, but the heavy rain blurred his vision. He kept the radio on, hoping for some distraction from the oppressive quiet that came with driving at night. At around 3 a.m., he noticed a figure standing on the side of the road, just barely visible in the downpour. The figure was waving, soaked to the bone, and Marcus instinctively slowed down. It wasn't uncommon to see stranded motorists or hitchhikers, and he always made it a point to help when he could. He pulled the truck to a stop and rolled down the window. The figure, a young woman, stood shivering in the rain. Her hair was matted to her face, and she was clutching her arms to her chest as if trying to stay warm. "Need a ride?" Marcus called out. The woman nodded, her face pale and expressionless. She climbed into the truck without a word, dripping water onto the seat. Marcus glanced at her as he pulled back onto the highway, but she didn't look at him. She just stared straight ahead, her face hidden beneath her wet hair. "Where are you headed?" he asked, trying to break the silence. "Just down the road," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Something about her unsettled him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. She was drenched and looked miserable, but there was something else, something about the way she held herself, so stiff and motionless. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. Minutes passed in silence. Marcus's eyes flicked to the woman again. She hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. His stomach twisted in unease. Then, out of nowhere, she spoke. "I need to tell you something." Marcus tightened his grip on the steering wheel, eyes focused on the road ahead. "I died on this road," she said softly. The words sent a chill down his spine. He turned to look at her, but the passenger seat was empty. The wet imprint of where she had sat remained, water dripping onto the floor, but she was gone. Panicked, Marcus pulled the truck over to the side of the road and scrambled out, looking around in the rain. There was no sign of her. His heart pounded in his chest, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. When he climbed back into the truck, he noticed something on the dashboard. A single photograph, soaked with water, showing a young woman, the same woman who had been in his truck. Written on the back were the words, "Please don't forget me." Story 3. Were the Whispering Walls. Jacob had recently moved into an old, weathered house on the outskirts of town. It had been a steel, an ancient 2-story home with creaky floors and a history no one seemed to know much about. He liked the isolation, the peace and quiet, or so he thought. The rain had been coming down hard for days, turning the yard into a muddy mess and making the house feel even more closed off from the world. That night, the rain drummed against the windows as Jacob tried to fall asleep in the master bedroom, but something about the house felt wrong. He first heard the whispers while lying in bed, the faint murmur of voices beneath the sound of the rain. At first, he thought it was his imagination, the result of being in a strange place, but the whispers grew louder, persistent. It was as if the walls themselves were talking. He sat up in bed, straining to hear. "Help us," the voices whispered. "We're still here." Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. He threw on his robe and walked down the hallway, trying to find the source of the sound. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. They echoed through the walls, faint and distorted. In a panic, he ran his hands along the walls, pressing his ear to the wood. The voices grew louder. "We're trapped," they said. "He won't let us leave." Jacob stumbled back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He didn't know what to do. Who were they? What were they? His mind raced as the whispers became more frantic. "Run!" the voices screamed. "He's here!" At that moment, the temperature in the house dropped, and Jacob's breath became visible in the freezing air. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls. The whispers grew into a cacophony of desperate pleas and warnings, all blending together in a nightmarish chorus. Suddenly, the lights went out completely. In the pitch-black darkness, Jacob felt a presence behind him, cold breath on the back of his neck. He turned slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. There, in the darkness, stood a shadowy figure, tall and imposing, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light from the storm outside. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deep, menacing voice that filled the room. "You shouldn't have come here," it growled. Jacob's scream was drowned out by the sound of thunder as the figure lunged toward him, and everything went black.